The shooting range. In this episode, a small bird with big teeth, the Yak-3T, combining old and new, the armor-clad slow miracle that went by the name of the Churchill. Hotline. The developers answer questions that you left in the comments. But first, let's start with fighting with a single flap. This but a scratch. Some warfighter pilots cannot help overreacting when their aircraft gets damaged. Well, it's totally understandable when your engine is dying just a few kilometers from the landing field, or when you can barely control your tail. Those are real, life-threatening problems. But trust us, there's absolutely no reason to lose your mind after losing a single flap. Imagine this. There is a high-speed duel, you extend the flaps without checking your airspeed, and one of your flaps comes off. You immediately lose balance and the plane starts rolling to the side where a flap is still in place. Let's retract it and see what we can do. In most cases, the enemy pilot wouldn't know which flap you've just lost, so it would still be entirely possible to fight him or her on your own terms. You're left with just the right flap? Good. That means that you can still make a quick roll to the right, as well as a mean tight turn while spiraling clockwise. Obviously, it will be harder to roll to the left, but that's not a big deal. Just do a barrel roll to the right instead. Furthermore, one flap is almost as good at keeping you in the air as the whole set, even at low speeds. Also, if you need to get the enemy that has the same speed and is at the same altitude, do it by rolling in with the help of your rudder. Just move in the opposite direction. For instance, you've lost the right flap and the enemy is on your left. That's the ideal scenario. Make short, careful moves to finally lock your guns on the target. But if you try to pull this off with an opponent on your right, you will almost certainly condemn yourself to unstable barrel rolls and will lose the trajectory. In this case, you'd better switch to mouse control. Speaking of computer mice, even if you're king or queen of RB, we still suggest that you should leave the pitch control to the instructor. This is especially useful while spiraling down. This way, you won't have to constantly correct the trajectory and will be able to focus on the other pressing matters instead. And the last thing, it is 100% okay to fly and fight with a single flap. But you'd better restrain from executing the hammerhead or the scissors and doing negative G-stalls. The aircraft just won't be stable enough, so make sure to retract that flap. It is sometimes said that the generals always prepare for the last war, not for the next one. When it comes to the Churchill infantry tank, that saying is especially true. On September 1, 1939, the General Staff issued a specification for the A-20, a new heavy infantry tank that was meant to be the replacement for the Valentine and the Matilda. The strategists, as keen as they were in all their brilliance, believed that the next war was going to be fought under similar conditions to those of the First World War. So naturally, they wanted an old-fashioned slow tank clad in excellent heavy armor and capable of navigating shell-cratered ground. Naturally. The first designs even included QF2 powder ordnance guns and machine guns placed inside sponsons. They also considered making it without a turret. This space was to be used to carry fascines that could help the tank cross large trenches. Basically, it was the upgraded and updated version of the familiar lozenge design of the Great War. In the end, the engineers ditched these sponsons and gave the tank a steel-protected turret, like the one on the Matilda, but it was still a very conservative design. The blueprints eventually made it to Vauxhall Motors, who tried their best to improve the performance of the tank, and thus the A-22, later christened the Churchill, was finally born. Surprisingly enough, the new war turned out to be nothing like the last one. But after the Dunkirk evacuation, the British were in no position to complain. They needed new machines, any machines, to replace the vehicles lost during the French campaign. The team behind the Churchill was forced to organize the mass production of their new tank in a very limited time frame, within a single year. Basically, because of that, the Churchill tanks roll off the production line before the designers had a chance to properly test them. The first vehicles were plagued with problems and flaws. Even the transmission linkages were prone to failure. The manufacturer had to add a special leaflet to the user's handbook, listing all known problems and saying, all those things, which we know are not as they should be, will be put right. And they kept the word. It took them some time, but eventually they licked the Churchill into shape. Let's see what the tankers had to work with. The choice of armament was initially as peculiar as the design itself. The tank carried a 2-pounder or a 40mm gun, which was firing only solid AP shells, basically very big bullets, and the 3-inch or 76.2mm howitzer that was to deliver HE shells. The idea was that the main gun would be used to fight other armored vehicles, while the howitzer would take care of the infantry and minor fortifications, but it didn't really work. The howitzer was a real pain to use due to its limited firing angles, and it was eventually dropped in favor of a conventional machine gun. One of the upsides of being designed for trench warfare, apart from the cross-country capabilities and great armor, was that inside the long and seemingly narrow hull of the tank, there was more than enough room for a crew of 5, big fuel tanks, and loads of ammunition. At the same time, the Churchill had a rather unorthodox transmission. It was the first tank to utilize the Merritt-Brown gearbox, which allowed the tank to be steered by changing the relative speeds of the 2 tracks. This made turns become tighter with each lower gear, ultimately allowing the tank to perform neutral turn. Furthermore, the steering system was controlled by a special tiller bar, instead of brake levers or a steering wheel. The system was later adopted at a number of other tanks, including the ones built after the war. All in all, the Churchill was an extraordinary machine, a mind-boggling combination of many things old and new. The first prototypes almost killed the series, but the actual combat allowed these tanks to prove that they were more than capable fighters. Older vehicles were reworked to bring them up to later standard, and even the newer machines underwent a number of modernizations that made them even more fearsome. But that's a story for another time. Now let's talk about one of the smallest and lightest major combat fighters of World War II and its best modification. The Yaks were the true people's fighter planes. In an attempt to speed up the advancement of his aircraft design, Alexander Sergeyevich Yakovlev introduced a revolutionary system of so-called collective engineering. This system allowed any person who had access to his planes, literally any engineer, mechanic, or even a pilot, to propose a rational idea on how to improve the design or the assembly process. If the idea was deemed worthy, it would be immediately implemented and the author would receive an award as well as some money. As a result, the Yak was being constantly improved at breakneck speed. The fighters were continually becoming lighter, faster, and deadlier. This was especially true for the Yak-7 fighter. Most of the parts that were originally made of wood were replaced with durable ones, making the planes much lighter. And what would you do with a very light plane? You'd give it the heaviest and the deadliest weapon possible, obviously. The engineers quickly decided to rig the Yak-7 with a heavy caliber gun that could wreck armored ground vehicles and literally rip the enemy aircraft apart with a single clear shot. The Yak-737 was the first to get a new toy, the powerful Spitalny MPH-37 gun. It was even a bit too heavy, but the pilots were so enamored with the prospect of blowing the German bombers to smithereens with only a single burst that they demanded the technology to be implemented as widely as possible. And oh boy, did their voices get heard. After a little while, Yakovlev's engineers gave the fighter that underwent so many modifications that it received a new name, an even better gun, the NS-37. That's how the Soviet aviators got the Yak-9, which doesn't really need an introduction. Yet another fighter that underwent an amazing evolution was the Yak-1. The weapons weren't a priority here. Initially, 2 Shkas were just replaced with a synchronized heavy-caliber BS guns. Most time was spent reducing the weight of the plane and refining the technology behind it. Like the Yak-7, by 1933 the fighter endured so many changes and modifications that it became a completely different aircraft that went by the name of Yak-3. It was all worth it. The Yak-3 was the lightest and the fastest fighter in the whole Allied roster. Even with a fair lot of wooden parts, it accelerated and retained speed like a racing aeroplane. Then came the time for a new armament. The Yak-3 was outfitted with a brand new 12mm cannon, the B-20. It was just as good as the previously installed ones, but weighed 25 kilos instead of 45. Naturally, that meant that the engineers could equip the fighter with 3 guns instead of 1, the only logical choice, of course. And the Yak-3 became the Yak-3P with 3 B-20 cannons. What a beauty! If you think they stopped there, you don't really get the way Soviet engineers worked. Alexander Nudelman, the chief designer of the NS-37 gun, eventually managed to make it so light that even the small Yak-3 could get its own heavy weapon, a new An-37 aircraft gun. The factories and people in the field had plenty of experience rearming the Yak-9T, so the upgrade was fast and easy. The newest Yak-3T, a lightweight fighter with heavy weapons, got into the air as soon as in early spring of 1945. And oh boy, was it an impressive machine. The Yak-3T retained the speed and maneuvering capabilities of the basic Yak-3, but easily outperformed even the most heavily armed single-engine fighters of the Luftwaffe with its outrageous 1-second burst mass. Sadly, its engine had a problem with overheating and wasn't fixed until summer, and by that time, there were no Germans to fight. In the end, the USSR government decided to drop the production of the Yak-3T. The top brass thought that the Yak-9 series were more than enough to fill all combat roles. The production of these planes was shut down, but in our game, you can still fly them and show any enemy what happens if a tiny bird gets large teeth. Now it's time for the traditional last part of our show, Hotline, developers answering questions from the comments. Strictly speaking, it's not the most serious-minded section of the show. If you want answers to be given with solemn faces, feel free to appeal to the official War Thunder forums. Here we'll have a more lighthearted discussion of the big questions of War Thunder. The first message comes from Joshua Ambry. Hi, will you add destroyers and cruisers to naval forces when it comes out? Hi Joshua, let's say we're currently testing something interesting. Keep your eyes peeled. A player called Sanktanker VN writes, Rank 2 Soviet tanks don't have any stabilization. Why? Well, it's fairly simple. The only vehicles that have stabilization in game are the vehicles that had such systems in real life. That's only fair, don't you think? Then there's a message from Superfine Druid 1. I was wondering if you plan to fix the Type 60 ATM issue where the commander/gunner replaces crew members that are lost and thus rendering the missile system ineffective. Thanks for the awesome game and keep up the good work. Thanks mate, we're tackling the issue. Long live the Emperor. The last and a very important question comes from Ktoish Nijnani. I like pancakes, Gaijin. Do you like pancakes? Pfft, who doesn't? That's it for today, but feel free to write your questions in the comments below. We do read them all, and you might see some of them answered in the next episode. If you like what we're doing, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. See you on the shooting range.